So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Shamika Ravi, the words of praises as rightly put by Professor Chan. So let me formally take it forward. She is well-regarded economist and member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, EAC PM of India. May I now invite Dr. Shamika to deliver the inaugural address. Ma'am, please.
Thank you all. Namaskar. I second everything on private universities. Dr. Chand, I'm so glad you mentioned it because often Delhi's view of things is quite limited. But you know, the whole idea of Vikasit Bharat, which is what I'm going to talk about today, private sector has a very large role to play, which is fundamentally about training the next generation of scholars and researchers and therefore knowledge builders. I think private sector is where a lot of the future growth and innovation also lies. So thank you very much to the host institution. Thank you very much to the Indian Economic Association for this very gracious invite. I'm going to talk about, and generally you've got a sense of, we are going to bring data to the big questions. The whole idea of it's relatively young and dynamic, which means the real world situation is changing every year. The reality on the ground is so dynamic that as policymakers, if you're sitting and trying to come up with the right recommendation, you are likely to be a few years behind the reality on the ground. How do I motivate that? Let me motivate by saying that, you know, in our census, of course, census 2011, if I ask you a simple question, how urban is India? As per census 2011, the reflex answer is 35%. If you are generous and you are pragmatic, you are likely to say maybe 40-45%. The fact is, India today, if you look at satellite data, if you look at the kind of work people do, because to be urban, you should be doing non-farming. The definitions are very well set. India is anywhere between 65 and 70%. So in reality, our economy is at least a decade ahead of our administration. And of course, because I'm sitting in Haryana, we must talk about our neighborhood. You know, the city of Gurgaon, which is like the power engine of the economy of this state, used to be governed not by urban local body as the millennial city, but by a series of panchayats. Now, can you imagine millennial city being governed and administered through what are fundamentally rural, village institutions? And that gives you a sense of why administration has to have latest data, latest evidence to really come up with policy which is correct or appropriate, right? So we are going to, I'm going to present 4 sets of points. I'll start by first talking about what Professor Ramesh Chand also talked about. What is happening to India's consumption? It's been 10 years and now we have consumption data at the household level. So we are in a position to see how Indians on an average are consuming. And it has changed a lot. And that I'm going to do using the NSS data. The second is what is happening to labor force participation, because there is an entire industry of research and scholarship that was built on the declining female labor force participation in India from 2004-5 to 16-17. And there are lots of papers, and I'm sure as economists, many of you would have read it. But what does the PLFS tell us? It's been 7-8 years. So what is the latest evidence? The third question is, I want to give you a sense of new kinds of data also. Of course, a lot of our survey data, and they are very good quality data. They're good data sets also in terms of the kind of innovation happening in data collection itself, within the government, also outside. But there are fantastic new data, particularly if you look at satellite imagery. Not just nighttime lights data, but also daytime, 10 meter into 10 meter. We know what is getting built where, how high, how energy efficient, and so on. How warm does it get? And so there is a lot of data which is new. And how do we look at that to understand India's modern growth? Next. Everything that I'm going to present to you will be trying to understand, first of all, our aspiration. We really have a very a clear articulated vision and an aspiration to become a developed nation. That is what Vikasit Bharat is. So if 2047 is the window that we are going with, the idea is, how does policy feed into realizing this dream? Because that is not just the job of one government or one office. It will take every segment of the economy, every state and union territory. Let's start with the consumption. So what has changed over the last 10 years? National Sample Survey. Of course, we are looking at nearly 4 lakh households. Next. We can gloss over this. Sabse pehle, what you see is rural, 164% increase in terms of average monthly per capita consumption expenditure. meaning one person's in the household per capita. Average monthly consumption expenditure has risen 164% in rural areas. It has increased 146% in urban areas. Next. Food is now, for the first time in India's development phase, food is now less than 50%. It is a marker of progress. In fact, if you look at cities, it is below 40%. It's actually 39%. We are seeing the diet becoming much more diverse. Earlier, we used to be thinking of food security from the point of rice and wheat. Now we are eating so much more. And it's not just us, people of a certain segment. Let's say this is the top 1 quintile. Even your bottom quintile, which means the bottom 20%, is consuming very diverse and new kinds of food. Okay? And how does this, obviously, if you're eating more and different kinds of food, it has direct bearing on your health. So I'm going to show you the data on what is it doing to anemia, which is one micronutrient, iron, that you want to look at. The policy implication of just these broad findings, number one, if food is now becoming a smaller share of the consumption basket, it immediately impacts the way we look at consumer price index or inflation. We cannot get spooked every time food inflation goes up, oh my God. So we need to recalibrate, and that the government is doing. Right? Agriculture policy. Now, if people are consuming differently, production policies must also respond to this changing demand on the market, which means agriculture policy will now have to gently maneuver production. It's not always easy, as you can imagine, but it has to be done to meet the different kinds of domestic demand. Health and nutrition policy, immediate impact, and some evidence I'll show you, and a little bit on urban planning. Next. Okay, this is a very dense plot. It's basically comparing the 10 years, but you know the big takeaways in rural India? Cereal as a share of your overall consumption expenditure is falling. In fact, it has fallen by from 11% it has gone to 5% or something. Big decline. What are the troubling aspects of this? Consumption of alcohol, gutka, pan, all of that is rising very fast. If you disaggregate the data, and this is where there is a role for economists, because I don't think it's easy to think of politically when you say your bottom 20% in your villages, rural area, spends much more on pan, alcohol, gutka than it does on education or health. There is a government role there. Yes, you have to make healthcare. That's the whole idea of Ayushman Bharat. You make education free. But what do you do for this kind of massive change in consumption pattern? Of course, I'm talking about bottom 20%. What is a similar problem in urban areas? Your top 20% in urban areas are consuming much more processed and packaged food. More sodium, more cholesterol, all kinds of ailments. But remember, all aspects of growth that we think of in agriculture, it's not production that we want to raise. It's when you process that food. That is the next phase of agricultural growth, processing and packaging. So now you're thinking as economists, ये तो बड़ा confusing है, because on one side your growth lies in processing and packaging and making things more durable, freeing up women's time. It can travel much more. But the downside of that is it is having health impact. And I think as economists, this is where the data matters. We have to understand at the disaggregated level, packaged food is also a very big black box. It has to be pulled out. Kurkure is not the same thing as, let's say, ordering 2 idlis. So now we have to go food item by food item and make distinctions. Next. Another thing to note, again, in urban area, food is below 40%. So remember, even food as an inflation, as a problem to be thought of, it is becoming very, shrinking really fast in urban areas in particular. In urban areas, households are now spending much more on conveyance. Remember, your roads have become very good. But that also means people are traveling a lot more. They are spending more on conveyance. We have to think of public transport. We have to think of, these are going to be the burdens of the future. So they are closely linked with how livable and quality of life of average households. Next. Okay, so share of food is falling. In that, share of cereal is falling. Share of packaged process is rising. Conveyance is rising. Pan, tobacco, alcohol. This is troubling. Share of jewelry, ornaments, etc. has doubled. People are saving, but not always in financial assets. Of course, you know that more Indians are on equity markets today than have ever been, which means these are big changes happening. Next. Okay, this we can skip. It's just to show that even the poorest households are consuming like the rich. Next. You can just skip all this. Next. Okay. Now, you know the beauty of this data, because many of you are economists. If I were talking to policymakers, I wouldn't go so much into data. But because you are interested in economics and economics research, and that's my mandate here to motivate you, this data is very good not just for spending, it's also very good for actual quantities. Actual kilogram, how much rice, how many fruits, how much meat, how much milk. So quantity data has become available and we can do a lot with it. Now, if you just look at what is happening to people across different quintiles, that graph is to tell you 10 years back, 11, 12, and what has happened to 22, 23. Top 20%, so the richest 20% and the bottom 20%. Do you see that overall, 10 years back, only 63% of Indians reported consuming some fresh fruits and alcohol. Fresh fruits. Today, that number is in excess of 90%. 90% Indians today are reporting that they are consuming some kinds of fresh fruits. Fresh fruits are different. It's important to study fresh fruits because it's a good proxy for affordability and access. Having it in the neighborhood. So if you have fresh fruits in Nagaland or villages of, let's say, Chhattisgarh, it means your back end, there are many things that are changing as far as logistics and supply chain, etc. are also concerned. These are perishable items. Fresh fruits are not growing everywhere. So there are many changes that are happening on the supply side. On an average, 43% increase has happened in that. But what about the poorest? In the poorest segment, only 44% used to eat some form of fresh fruits. Today, that number is 82%. You have seen an 86% increase. Your biggest increase are happening at the bottom of the pyramid. Next. What about the quantity, actual kilograms? 10 years back, they were consuming 1.9 kilogram on an average. Today, it is 2.7 kilogram, which means, and this is per capita, by the way, per person, 42% increase in quantity. So you're not just spending more, you're actually consuming more. What about the bottom 20%? There's an 87% increase in the quantity consumed. Are you also seeing, and I can show you this for multiple kinds of food, everybody's consuming more, but your poorest are consuming much more. So there is also a decline in consumption inequality as far as many kinds of food items are concerned. Next. Same thing you will see for urban India. Next. Where are the biggest increase? The biggest increase is happening in your remote parts of the country and northeastern states. These are the places where the biggest push of infrastructure has happened. The cold storage change, right? The entire supply chain. That is what you see, the kind of expansion happening. Next. Same story for milk and milk products. Of course, milk relative to fruits, fresh fruits is lesser because we've had an Operation Flood and a mission run for some time now. But on average, 16% increase. And for the poorest, of course, the increase is much more. Next. Quantity, the same story. The poorest segments are seeing biggest increase. Next. Eggs, fish and meat. Despite the fact that many of you might believe India is becoming more vegetarian, if you are on social media, that's not true at all. Indians today are consuming a lot more eggs, fish and meat than they have in the past. 25% increase in terms of number of people consuming, 36% increase amongst the bottom poorest percent. Next. What about quantity? 45% increase in the quantity of eggs, fish and meat overall. Amongst the poorest section, it's 80% increase. All right, so we are eating more. Next. Cereals. Now, cereals is a bit odd because what people are doing are consuming less. This is cooked in the house. Okay, this is that data. Now, cooking wise, meaning the amount of rice actually getting cooked is 2 kilo less per person per month. So, Indians on an average are consuming, at least in terms of cooking in the house, 2 kilo less. That's a big increase per person. So, if you're a household of 5, 10 kilo fewer, right, lesser. This is a big change, but it's expected because you can't be eating more rice, wheat and vegetables. You are substituting away from carbohydrates into more the higher nutrients, right? Next. And again, keep looking at the relative difference of the poorest and the richest. Huh? Quantity cereal, even urban India, it's again similar reduction. Next. So food grain. Now, there is something remarkable happening as far as the food grains program in India is concerned. A very simple way, simplistic way to look at it is 80% of Indians are being given, well, it's 60%, so 80 crore people are being given free food grains. It's a matter of shame. You'll hear sometimes, why are we giving, if people are so better off, why are we giving so much free food grains? Number one, because you have a lot of food grains. As Professor Ramesh Chand told you, our production of cereals has risen a lot. We have a lot. And sometimes it's best to give away because the cost of storage and movement, etc., distribution is far, far more costly. What you have effectively done is you have fiscalized the food plate, which means people are now saving what they would otherwise have spent on food grains, and that spending is being channeled into other kinds of food items. This is called fiscalization. The government is paying for food grains, you have improved your spending on everything else because you have saved in terms of food grains. Next, seasonality. This is such a remarkable finding. If you see, these are the 12 months of the year. 10 years back, do you see that consumption of fresh fruits, again, seasonality matters for fresh fruits. Do you see that in the summer months, because summer is when in India we get more fresh fruits because mangoes and lychees, and there are lots of seasonal fruits. You're seeing the number of people, 72, 73% in the summers, otherwise it would be 50s, 60s. Winter months we didn't have as much. So there is great degree of seasonality you saw 10 years back. What about now? Look at the second panel. It's a straight line. 90% people are getting fresh fruit throughout the year. The seasonality has been overcome, but why? Not because we only like fruits in summers, now it is available around the year. This is what logistics and back-end supply chain improvements and what infrastructure is doing to our consumption. Next. Now very quickly let us look at what impact is it having on iron. Anemia is what I'm interested in, the study, and I recommend to those of you interested in this, please download and read the study. It's a very comprehensive. We look at multiple micronutrients. In terms of iron, next. If you look at cereals, happen to be a very large source of iron because we fortify cereals also, right? We put iron in cereal. Now, across all the quintile group, 9.9 milligram of cereals. Iron is received from cereal. But if you remove cereal, then on an average, a person is consuming only 4.5 milligram, right? Next, cereals are the most important source of iron for India, in urban as well as rural India. So that is the first story. Cereals are the biggest source of iron because we are fortified. Next. If you look at diversity, however, how many more different kinds of food, and the measure we use is a Shannon index. Shannon index is, we borrow from study of biosphere, where you see how many kinds of species reside in a locality. And when species run away, there is attrition. When pigeons come, they drive away other birds. So these are very good measures that you use from different kinds of discipline and you bring into economics. Here we are seeing in the food plate, what are the different sources of iron? Earlier, cereal used to be your biggest source of iron, but what is happening now? You are getting iron from fruits, from all these other kinds of things. On an average, for all quintile groups, over the 10 years, food is becoming more diverse in terms of iron, because these are results I'm showing you for iron. It's the case for all micronutrients because you're eating more different kinds of things. Next. It's for every state of the country. So this is not a story driven by few states. Like the growth story when we say manufacturing or maybe agricultural superstar, no. Food diversity is increasing across the country, in rural and urban, in every state. Next. If you look at, and this is just a small example, what are the sources of iron in Kerala? 40% iron for an average Kerala household comes from fresh fruits. Only 12%, 22% comes from cereal. But in Uttar Pradesh, do you see 70% is the main source of iron is cereal? What about Rajasthan, which has the least dietary diversity in the country? Overwhelmingly, almost 84 is it? I can't read from it. 84 is from cereal. So all the states are changing, some states are changing more. It also has to do with local availability and food habits. Just because it is available doesn't mean everyone's going to eat it. So please also recognize that economy will go so far, but culture and food habits, a lot of old cooking ways, we'll have to go back to some of those things as well. Next. What is the impact on anemia? Next. You see on the x-axis here, you have the log value of what is happening to diversity and the incidence of anemia, because you marry this data with National Family Health Survey, NFHS, and you know the incidence of anemia. Do you see that as your food gets more diverse, anemia is crashing? Now, the funny thing is that more intake of iron will reduce anemia. That is the definition of anemia. But more diverse sources of iron will reduce anemia much faster. Which means fortification is good for a country which suffers from anemia. We are going to fortify rice, and hopefully in the future we will continue to fortify wheat, etc., because it's easy to do. But over time, the bigger gains are from making people eat more different kinds of nutritious food. And it's so common sense. That's what economic growth is all about. Next. Okay. There is another measure of what is, again, it's the same data. People are less vulnerable health-wise. Earlier, remember, we used to measure what happens to poverty if you fall sick. 7% Indians were getting impoverished due to healthcare. But now that absolute poverty is below 3% in India, that is a very simple measure. Can we look at vulnerability? Because even the richer households, if somebody goes to a private hospital and has 1 week of length of stay, you are likely to incur a bill of 6-7 lakhs. An average household, even in your top quintile, has to cut down consumption somewhere. So that is a mark of vulnerability. When I'm hit with a shock, like hospitalization, how much consumption do I have to cut? Do I fall to the next bracket? I'm in the rich 20%, do I fall into the next? These are measures of vulnerability which we are bringing into modern, new, day-to-day policy making. Next. Look at asset ownership amongst the poorest 20% in India. This is vehicular ownership, because vehicle is a major lump sum expense, right? It's expensive. What you're seeing is, and why do I look at vehicles? Because this is not provided by the government. I'm not looking at Awas Yojana. I'm not looking at free XYZ that the government might be giving. You look at vehicles, because vehicle is something you buy. So in the poorest 20% of Indians, 10 years back, 4% had some vehicle. Mostly these are bikes and scooters. Today that number is 40%, a little bit in excess of 40%. It's a 900% increase. Do you see what that, of course, policy implication means? Now, even in the villages, everybody's got bikes. We have to think of traffic, lights, congestion, all kinds of other things. But these are all markers of improvement in quality of life. That is what your data is telling you. Also, remember, when you buy vehicle, very few people go and put cash. It's also an expansion in the formal banking, because a lot of this is financed formally. Next. Okay, very quickly, let's go over the female labor force just to show you that the recent trends are extremely encouraging. Next. This is just defining what is labor force participation. Next. We have lots of very rich data over the last 7 years, 8 years. Next. You see the crash? That has been very well studied. There is not a single paper on what has happened after the crash. You see, real policy making needs scholarship. I'm here to really tell you that if you are economists who are interested in impacting policy, kindly go to the data. Look at the data, write, ask first order questions. What is happening to labor force participation? Consistently rising in the last 8 years. It is rising much more in rural areas than it is rising in urban areas. Next, to one question again, what Professor Ramesh Chand said, that it's our unpaid work. We have been told, yes, in India it is rising, but it's all unpaid work. Actually, that's not true at all, because this analysis removes all unpaid work. Now, when you remove unpaid work from all the data sources since 2004, what do you see? That crash did still happen, but the rise also happened. This does not include any unpaid work in the household or household. Do you still see a rapid expansion? So there is something happening, and particularly in rural parts of India, where women are coming out and participating. All right. Now, unpaid work and women, that in fact, there's an entire paper around care economy. 17% of GDP, that is the value of care that women are giving in the household. But there is no money transacted, therefore, we discount it. But I think which is a more institutional story, Professor Chand, which we have to think about. Are we discounting it in the family also? Because if we value, and that is where we say that Indian growth and development must have Indian characteristics. Our declining fertility rate at a stage when we are still under $3,000 per capita, rich countries have seen that. When women enter labor force, fertility does decline. And mind you, no country has managed to reverse it, no matter how much money you throw at the problem. if it's happening at such a low stage of growth, what are we going to do about it? Of course, internal migration will take care of some of that problem. But then what? Our dependent population will continue to expand. Our working population will continue to shrink. How do we even sustain this growth? Because we have just come out of poverty. We have a long way to grow. So we have to, I'm not just saying we put a value to it statistically. वो तो सबसे आसान है. As economists, we know. We put a shadow value and we put, okay, 17%. How does that translate into actual change on the ground? We say an average Indian woman from the age group of 18 to 59, that is your working age, spends 4 to 5 hours taking care of someone. That's the kind of time we spend, because care is almost entirely on the shoulders of women. It's not just children. It's also 120 million elderly above the age of 60, and that population is expanding. How do you help women do this? By the way, another very dismal, and this is to the ladies in the room, a major shout out. The amount of leisure time that working women in India have, minimal. You have barely like 15 minutes or something. So then what are you looking at? It's mental health. You're looking at depression. You have no leisure time. How is that even sustainable? Because you're working outside and you're working in the house. The point is, if you don't value this, this will get reflected in the form of crashing fertility. We'll have to value it, and we will have to reduce the costs for women. Next. The increase is everywhere. This is just to tell you it's in rural India all over. Next. Urban India all over. Next. Across all your states. In fact, Professor Chand mentioned Bihar having low, but we are actually in a state where traditionally female labor force participation has always been very low. Punjab and Haryana, richest states of the country, for so many years, labor force participation of women historically very low. So culture matters. It is not just affluence which is leading to it. Bihar is your poorest state. Punjab, Haryana are your richest for a long time. Haryana particularly. Labor force participation of women takes time and culture. It's not just money. Next. All this you can skip. He's also a conduit for people moving. Yes. Okay. Now let's go back. Okay. This is a very important story. Institutions matter also, and this is something we have not yet talked about openly. Why is it that married men in India, because again we have talked of marriage and women, and what about men? Marriage makes a difference to men's participation also. Married men in India enter labor force early and they leave labor force much later. Unmarried men, on the other hand, are very late to enter labor force. They don't enter until the age of 30 and beyond, and they exit much sooner. For a country which is aspiring to grow, for such a large population, we only talk about women's labor force and saying we must raise women. What about unmarried men? If marriage as an institution, why are so many of our youth waiting till the age of 30 to do something? Why are we so busy taking exams? It's a reflection of a deeper, I'm saying that there are no easy fixes. Ye badha do, ye ghata do. The way multilateral institutions, many people when they come and lecture us, it's, I think, Professor Chand, and he raised these very difficult and important questions. Part of the reason why people come and lecture us, one, I think it's just poor economics. We should be very honest about it. I think they're doing injustice to the discipline. Second is poor understanding of institutions. These are outcomes. These are not levers. कि labor force participation बढ़ा दीजिए. आप ऐसे नहीं बढ़ा सकते. You have to understand why is women's labor force participation down. Why are unmarried men entering labor force so late, exiting so fast? If marriage as an institution is a disciplining mechanism, you've got to sustain your wife and kids and so on, then we have to have a serious conversation about what are seemingly institutions under a lot of stress today. Not just marriage, but children for sure, families for sure. Because we have seen this in the West. During pandemic, this is a very dismal data, we saw the largest number of elderly people die alone without a family around. That is when we started to say, this is not the growth and development we want. There should be fundamentally Indian characteristic in what we are trying to do. Families are important to the economy. But if families are important, then we must have policies which support families. Which means it should enter your tax policies, it must enter your care economy, spending on these kind of institutions. Next. Marriage is good for men, marriage is bad for women as far as labor force participation is concerned. Next. Presence of children doesn't affect the men. Presence of children does affect the women, but what is interesting, and the paper talks about it, every state it affects differently. Married women in Rajasthan and Bengal in rural areas tend to work more. Married women with children. Even in Kerala, unmarried women tend to work less if there is a baby in the family. Could be your niece, could be your nephew. You stay back and you help. Do you understand why talking India's labor force is declining or rising? This is just such lazy research. India is a very large country. Every state, our average district is 2 million people. It should blow your mind. So to broad brush statistics means nothing as far as India is concerned. It's not helpful for policy making. Next. Next. ये चलते जाओ अब, let's just, these are stories. Okay, just go back to the last, absolutely 2 seconds on, new kinds of data set. You know, survey data has human error, you can say all kinds of things. This is satellite image of a daytime. You are seeing 10 meter into 10 meter what's happening. Okay, this is, okay, let's go next. Let's look at global settlement. This is just to tell you what happened from 2010 to 15 and 15 to 20. The shades, these are constituencies, parliamentary constituencies. And this paper is called Politics Matters. Okay? This is to tell you governance matters. And of course, we have tried to do this comparing Odisha and Bihar. Bihar was richer than Odisha in 1991. Who remembers that? Today, Odisha is 2.5 times richer per capita than Bihar. So let's not pretend governance does not matter. Governance matters. In fact, a new case study we are publishing is to say Uttarakhand and Himachal. Himachal was much poorer, 50% poorer. Today, Himachal has overtaken, Uttarakhand has overtaken Himachal in what, 20 years? Per capita wise. Governance matters, policies matter. Growth is not something that just happens or Delhi will do growth. Growth is very localized. This is to tell you each of your parliamentary constituencies after 2015 have had much higher growth in terms of built up area. Next. Your red, these are parliamentary constituency. This is 2010 to 15 and that is 15 to 20. Red means growth of real growth of more than 5%. It's anywhere from 5 to 10. Do you see how the redness in India is spreading? Your local, so India's growth is 6%, 7%. That is just macro indicator. My constituency, my district, how is that growing? That is what is relevant at a local level as far as both your parliamentary system of democracy, your representatives should be able to tell you or give you growth. Your administrator, your district collector should be concerned. Eventually, democracy is about highly localized, right? Do you see how that redness is spreading? And a lot of that redness is in very remote parts. It's not happening in Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, etc. It's happening really in the relatively more remote parts. Next. On the x-axis, here you have the least developed parts, meaning very remote to most remote on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, you are seeing the kind of growth you are seeing. Do you see that your highest growth is in the least developed parts of the country? It's a negative relationship. But that's your infrastructure push. When you have border roads expanding, your roads are going for the first time to new areas. Electrification is happening mostly in rural and remote parts. This is what inclusive development from an infrastructure point of view or a housing policy, etc. looks like. Next, I think that might be the end. This is again, you can go all the way down to subdivisions, okay? And again, at subdivision, it looks even more impressive. The graph is obviously very dense because suddenly you have a lot of observations. It's no longer just 545 constituencies. Next. Same. Biggest growth is happening in your most remote, underdeveloped. Moving forward, this is absolutely to just wrap up and to see what am I doing here and why did I accept to come here and spend 3 days? It's because policy making, let me assure you, the government doesn't have the wherewithal to do all the research that is, in fact, do most research. It lies outside the government. It really lies in the scholarly community. Economists have a very distinct identity because of the training as a discipline that we receive. That's why it's a social science. We have to do a lot more research, because the country needs a lot more real-time knowledge, highly localized knowledge. Right? I think part of the effort right now is how do we enhance not just the training capabilities, because many of you are also professors and teachers. I've been teaching for 22 years now. It's also important for you to grow the next generation of scholars. But research and knowledge creation for better policy making is very, very important and largely rests on your shoulders. Otherwise, the space, the way we see it, is being, I think we have abdicated some of our core responsibility as scholars in the society to mostly consulting firms. And that, from a long-term perspective, is not an acceptable outcome, because we know what the job for consultants are. They're giving you short-term fixes. They're giving you quick, nice PowerPoint presentations. I think eventually that is the larger responsibility we have as economists to society, and particularly for one which aspires to be viksit and developed in such a narrow frame of time. So thank you very much. I look forward to meeting each of you over the next 3 days.